from two different collections. I'm going to read from a collection called The Warrior, which is made up of poems that I wrote while my son was deployed, and also while he was going through training to become a Green Beret. We were at different ends of the spectrum as far as politics, and there was a lot of tension. And when he actually went to war, we were not getting along very well, and it was a source of just deep grief to me. And the way I coped with it was through writing these poems. And I must tell you that he is fine. He's out of the Army now. He's healthy, good, came back, okay. And these poems brought us back together. So if nothing else, poetry can do that. It can bring people back together. The other piece that I'm going to read from is something that I am just thrilled about, called Voices of the Guard. And this is a book of poems that is written from the voices of National Guard soldiers and their family members who I interviewed over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. And then this became actually their voices. I really didn't change their words or the way they said things. I just had to leave out 11 hours of what they said. So, it's a distillation of just some of the most beautiful conversations I've ever had with anyone. And so I want to share a little of that with you today, too. So I'll start with The Warrior. And I'm going to start with a poem called The Aztec Empire. I live in New York, and this poem comes from going to a museum and seeing artifacts from the Aztec Empire. And they're just beautiful things that would just take your breath away. But as I went through the exhibit, what I was learning was that the Aztec Empire was a pretty brutal, as far as they were a warrior society, and they were pretty brutal in the way that they looked at life and the loss of life and that sort of thing. So this poem was actually started while I was going through. The Guggenheim Museum in New York goes like this, and then all the exhibits are around the wall. So you're actually, this particular exhibit, you started at the bottom and you wound your way up like that. Just so you know, I think you need to know that so that at the end you'll understand why what happened. The Aztec Empire, the Guggenheim 2004. Listen, dearie, there is no world without war. An unfamiliar voice in my head. I stand at the beginning, before stone-plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl, celestial being of the dawning east, wind and breath. Beautiful, if beauty can live where young men die for kings. Does the voice mean there can only be a world if there is killing? My son is in Iraq. I see him in the faces of soldiers on the news, in the Times. The voice in my mind, like the tune of a song I hate but can't forget, doesn't care about the dark circles around their eyes or about the black alcove, a stone altar shaped like a bridge, a slave bent backwards so the priest could slide a flint knife into his ribs, extract his beating heart, a sacrifice for an Aztec god, the blood caught in this exquisite bowl behind glass, red, white, black, glyphs of gold, the eye of night. The warriors drank from it too, for land, for women. They used the blood the way we use money, to keep their world going. Across the spiraled ramp, an eagle warrior, a man's face shadowed inside a beaked helmet. Slightly bent at the waist, he could be bowing, if not for the meanness of his costume. Talons jut from his knees. The stucco edges of ceremonial feathers spike at his shoulders. Before he was a warrior, he was a boy. Before he drank blood, he drank milk. So what, says the voice, we're all going to die. Who are we to judge? But I'm dizzy, I reply. Something knocked loose inside my inner ear. Or perhaps it was the dark body of the snake. I walked its coil to the cross of its destroyer. I had to place my back against a wall to keep from falling. My son went to West Point. I didn't want him to go. I didn't want him to be a soldier. But by the time he graduated, I loved West Point, and I loved the cadets that I met there. And I grew up during the Vietnam years, and at West Point's a living monument to many of our great leaders who we're here today living in freedom because of some of the people who went to some of our academies and led, armies of people who really cared. And so my son had an effect on me. He changed my mind. And the day that he graduated it was such a celebration, and it was in 1998. Clinton was president. There was no war. We were hearing about possibilities for different kinds of wars, but we were at peace at that time. So this poem is called The Barn Swallows. My son is always leaving. Sometimes he looks back and waves goodbye. Sometimes he just disappears. Where is he now? In the air, returning from Poland? On the ground, training at Fort Bragg? The day he graduated from West Point, the sun was so bright I couldn't see the Secretary of Defense, a dark speck under the white awning on a makeshift stage, saying something about the world, about danger, a different kind of war. No one else seemed to notice the barn swallows swoop in like a swarm of enormous black butterflies, their throats bloodied, marring the brilliance of the sky. They arrived out of nowhere, the way my son was suddenly a man. As each new lieutenant shook the secretary's hand, the swallows dipped and keened over the fields, the barracks, those gray castles of learning, the dead generals bronzed on pedestals. What had drawn them to this moment? The red sash and the saber. What had drawn my son to this life? Where had it come from, his certainty of purpose? When I was my son's age, I had no faith. Now I believe in the prescience of wings, each bird, its presentation of colors, bearing the messages we pray will never come. Looking down through borrowed binoculars into the perfect rose, I searched for his face. When Ben went to, he was getting ready to go to Iraq. At that point, he was a Green Beret. This was his first tour. He'd bought a new house. He wanted me to see the house. He was out in Colorado, I'm in New York. And he said, I want you to come see my house, but you have to promise not to cry. Because he was packing to go. And so when I got there, his gear was all over the house, packing to go to Iraq. And there were boxes over here. He was moving in at the same time. So, I took one look at his gear, and it was like, I knew I was going to cry. So one of my coping mechanisms is to distance myself by, I asked him if I could write about the things that he was taking with him and the process he was going through, and that removed me a little bit, enough that I could hold it together till I got home. And I told him that I'd write a poem he went through everything with me. And I'm going to read, it ended up being a 6-part poem called 1 Week Before Deployment. And again, it was supposed to be 1 page, right? But I'm going to read you 3 pieces of this poem, 3 parts of this poem. Number 1 is packing. There was something about the helmet in a pile of gear by the fireplace. Once another soldier's, now my son's. It called to me the way the dying do when they can no longer speak, an irresistible pull, like gravity or love. 2 pairs of desert camo boots stood beside the black recliner. They shouldn't have been beautiful, shimmering like suede, lightweight for easy movement, never worn. A man can't wear another man's boots. They mold to his feet, carry his scent, his sweat absorbed in the hide. They take on the shape of his bunions, his burdens, the soles worn down with his rhythms, his weight when he walks. I've seen pictures of those makeshift totems in the desert. They call the name out 3 times, the silence. A pair of boots beside a rifle, its nose in the sand, the barrel standing for the soft ribs of a body. And this is to the helmet. Ghost of a moon half draped in the folds of his rain poncho, how many have died because you weren't enough, because you couldn't be everywhere? I wanted to put you on, but you weren't mine. Your only country, that remnant of the fontanelle I felt once while he slept, before the bones closed over it. His gun. I looked for it the way I looked for that rattler in the field when I was small. Dark diamonds, beautiful, shed skin, a shadow in the basket among sheets and clothespins. He left it out of sight, as if recalling my refusal when he was a boy to buy him one. The only evidence it existed, a small brown square of paper, slightly buckled, 3 holes shot through at the heart, lying on the table by his will. I must have seemed a hypocrite that winter I visited him in Bamberg, his first command, and asked to watch him practice on the range. He said he'd rather not, and when I pressed, "It's not my gun," meaning, I suppose, he didn't choose it, didn't love it. One more possession, government issue, passed from hand to hand. It wasn't about blood or necessity. It wasn't about love. Or maybe it was, all of these, that drove my desire to see how he carried it, if he cradled it, how it fit against his body, to see the side he hides from me, the dark beauty.